So Leah, please share with us today really what we want to make happen for people.
Yeah, great. And thanks again, everybody. I appreciate people are putting in. If you just joined us, please do put your name and organization and where you're from in the chat. That just helps us see who's here. Thank you for having your screen on if you can. If you can't, don't worry. But we are really we're gonna be working together. We're really gonna be doing a lot of hands-on examples and such. So this will be fun. And again, even if you're a brand new newbie, no worries. This is really gonna be geared towards you as well. So we really set out 3 goals for today's training. And number 1, thinking about timing, like I said, we want to raise awareness and action for the goal of Vision Zero or zero traffic deaths by really leveraging the upcoming event of the International World Day of Remembrance for road traffic victims. If anyone doesn't know what that is yet, and I'll ask Kate, actually my colleague Kate, thank you Kate for all you're doing. If you'll put in the chat box, Kate, a little bit more about upcoming World Day of Remembrance. I think most of you I see are very familiar with it probably, but that's happening November 21st, International Day to honor and remember those we've lost and those who've been injured and hurt, and really thinking about how do we change this transportation system to be safe for everyone. We'll get into that. So number 1, really thinking about leveraging that event. Number 2, like I was just saying, really helping to empower us all with effective storytelling and media outreach skills to advance your goals ongoing. So maybe you're not able to do a lot for World Day of Remembrance, or maybe you do and it's one event and then it's over, but you really want to be thinking, how do you really plan a strong 2022? How do you think about next year getting your message out, and why is media important there? And Melissa and Jim will cover more on that. So ongoing empowerment there and skill building. And then number 3, this is a really big long-term one, but I just want to go ahead and plant the seed. We have real potential, and I would say responsibility, to influence the news media and the way they report on these issues, the way they cover these issues. We know how important it is. We won't spend a ton of time on this one today. It's a whole other ball of wax. But you know, we all know the crash not accident language, right? And we know that media is not the only information source out in the world, but it's a pretty big one. So how can we, through our work, really influence the way that media then covers these important issues in a way that can actually be more accurate and honest, and really bolster the change that we're working to make. And I just want to recognize here, I know we sent this out just so you guys know, kind of a sampling. I think a lot of you probably recognize each other's names and stuff, but just to kind of give a sense of who we invited today, so you know kind of who's in the room. We really sent this out to, you know, I consider friends and family, even though we don't know all of you, but it's meant to be for those of us working in our own sphere, whether that be at the local level or maybe a state level, maybe it's your own neighborhood, maybe it's your city, on safety on our roads. And I know for some on the call, that is because you've lost a loved one and you're active with Families for Safe Streets. And thank you so much for putting your loss into this work. And then for some of us, you know, we're advocates who are helping because we, you know, have had experiences where we just want to see it as a city be better for walking and biking and more livable. So we're coming from sometimes different places here, but I feel really honored to share this room with people who care a lot, whether through personal experience or their professional advocacy work. But we really did invite folks who we know care about this issue. Again, we might be all over the spectrum in terms of media experience. Some of us might be hired by organizations that we, you know, frankly, get a salary from. That's great. Some of us are doing this 100% volunteer. And I want to say thank you, especially to you. So when people talk about like, oh, communications director, most people don't have a communications director, right? We are our own communications directors. So we want to help you have, you know, a little bit of, or a lot of comfort on that little bit of role that you can play in that place. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and say thank you so much, and pass it back to Melissa and Jim for the presentation and then the discussions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Leah. That was beautiful. And I'm going to turn this over to Jim to talk about our intentions further today and what we're going to specifically cover.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Leah. And thank you, everybody, for being here. It's really great to see so many people on this call. Before we dive in, I just want to take a moment to name what may be the elephant in the room, which is that this work can be emotionally very difficult. We've all felt urgency, frustration, confusion, anger, fear, as well as the sadness we feel about traffic victims and their survivors. Some of us are survivors ourselves. Of course, all those feelings are real and valid, but sometimes they can start to feel overwhelming What I've done to keep myself moving forward is to remember the underlying goodness of what we're all trying to do here. No matter what else you may be feeling right now, remember that you're doing good work for the right reasons. You're helping make your community a better place for everyone. So take a moment to appreciate your own efforts and the efforts of everyone on this call. And by all means, come back to that feeling of appreciation whenever you need to recharge and refresh. We need every one of you to be at the top of your game. And with all of that in mind, here's what we're going to be covering today. We kind of 3 sections to this presentation: the power of using storytelling to leverage the media, how to feel confident when working with the media, and some role playing to help us apply what we've learned. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa.
Thank you very much. That was beautiful, both of you. I think you really set the right tone for all of us. So now we're going to talk about, why the heck the media, and, frankly, it's a numbers game. So whatever your goal is right now, whatever you're starting with, or whatever you get inspired by this training for, getting your story successfully into the media, and we don't mean just once, but as an ongoing strategy. That's something to remember, an ongoing strategy. It can really help you and your organization, or just yourself as an individual, in 2 really key ways. The first is that it gives your work and cause legitimacy. It warms the room for you with civic leaders and other types of leaders who are more likely to grant you access and resources and support because they heard about you or read about you or saw you in the media. And Jim's going to go into that a little bit more, but I want to touch on that now. And then it's, again, a numbers game. The media is one of the places that you can still really exponentially grow your reach. So what am I talking about there? Let's look at San Francisco. And this is from the media kit right now of the San Francisco Chronicle. And Jim's going to go into what's been happening with the news media over the past decade. But as it's been kind of shrinking, in some ways it's been growing, meaning that the online platforms have really taken off. So I don't know about you, but as popular as Petal Love is, and I'm very proud of it, we don't have 34 million as a reach. And I doubt most of you do. So really think about it. Your local newspaper, it might only have 15,000 as the subscribers for it, but still, do you have 15,000 active readers on your email newsletter list? Some of you here might, but the local organizations, I'm guessing maybe not. So it's still a place to really get your story out there. And right now, we're going to talk a little bit about the first interactive game that we want to play. This is straight out of Saul Alinsky, Political Organizing 101, writing out a lay down, a stretch, and a visionary goal. So each one of us are at different places where we could be a local organization, we could be regional, we could be statewide, we could be national. We're at different places, we're newbie, middle, we could be an expert, but we want you to be thinking strategically about media relations. So lay down would be, let's say you're an organization that this is the very first time that you've hosted a World Day of Remembrance event and you want to write a press release and invite the media. Great, that's one of the next things you're going to do. But you recognize that World Day of Remembrance falls on a Sunday, and the person that covers the traffic beat, or the person that covers health and well-being in a way that you think they'd be interested, they don't work on Sunday. So you're going to invite them as a stretch goal, because it's a little nerve-wracking to call up a reporter or send them an email and say, could you come and please meet us for coffee on Thursday? And we want to show you this dangerous intersection. This is the core reason that we're doing World Day of Remembrance. 5 people got killed here last year. And then a visionary goal could be, you could write an op-ed for that very same paper or a different paper. Or if you're a bigger organization, maybe you're ready to have a press conference. And what I prefer instead are actually media events where you organize meetings. Like, for example, when I was the media director of the California Bicycle Coalition, I organized 2 media briefings, and they were basically from 8 a.m. until noon. Every half hour, we had organized press events where we had different people invited to come, one right after the other. We had fantastic coverage that way. But I am going to share with you a funny little story about Jim, and that he really walks the walk, okay? So I don't remember if it was the helmet or it was a 3-foot, But what happened is that we were going to be in Sacramento for the event, and it was either CBS or ABC News. They couldn't make it. They had something else going on, but they're like, we're really interested in this. But here's the thing. We need you to have somebody meet us on a street someplace at 5 a.m. I knew that Dave Snyder was not going to get up that early. He was going to have a long day. And so I called Jim and I said, Jim, you know, I've got somebody great. I've got a news director lined up. Will you meet them at 5 a.m.? And he did. So I want you to think about that. He's going to get into why you need to be available for the media. But again, he walks the walk. So we're going to take a minute and a half right now. And I want you to write down a lay down, a stretch, and a visionary goal that you have for your organization. It could be for you yourself, could be for your organization, or could be for maybe you're working in collaboratively. And I'm going to set the timer right now, and we're just going to go right now. Go, minute and a half. Here we go. Lay down, stretch, and a visionary goal that you have for media placement. It could be to get an event listing. It could be to get a story on your local NPR station. It could be to get on television. Only you can decide which would be a lay down, which would be a little bit harder, which would be a stretch. Okay, we've got just about a minute left. Just about 30 seconds. Ten seconds left. Wrap it up. Okay, so what I want you to do, thank you, because I love seeing all you scribbling away there. I want you to set that aside, and we're going to come back to that. So don't lose it. Leave it right there, okay? So now you've thought about your media placement goals, and I wanted to share with you that Lee and I wrote a press release last year that I pitched to Tanya Moan, who is one of the only national reporters that actually writes about traffic safety from a travel point of view. And I sent it to her because she writes for the New York Times and she writes for Forbes, and she posted more or less our press release verbatim. This does not happen very often, but for those of you who really want to work with press releases, think about taking them to another level and writing them as if they are a full-fledged actual article, and you never know, you could get lucky. So I just wanted to toot our horn about that one. That was pretty fun. So why storytelling as part of media relations? Well, the fact is that stories are in our DNA, and they're how we make sense of the world. And if you've got a lot of data and statistics and you want people to remember them, especially reporters, you've got to wrap your data in a personally engaging story. So I'm not going to go deep into how to craft stories today, because that's not what this is about. But I will tell you that we're going to share my storytelling map at the end of this. And on November 10th, I'm going to be doing a free storytelling workshop. So I invite all of you to be a part of that. But I do want to highlight a few things about storytelling and why it's so important. So stories are very different than anecdotes, and here's why. Stories that work well have structure. And this is structure that has been proved throughout time, throughout history. Most of them are shaped like a pyramid, I will tell you. It's all in my map, but if you Google it, Google looking up the basic narrative structure, and you'll learn about this 5-step structure. And the reason why you want this is because stories change brain chemistry, right? So stories, when you hear a story, it releases cortisol and adrenaline, which are stress hormones that make you pay super attention. It releases the oxytocin, the feel-good hormone that makes you feel empathy. And it releases dopamine. There's an interesting two things about dopamine. The thing about dopamine is it's the reason why somebody who went to the movies or read a book says, oh, wow, I feel like I really did something. And your friends are like, no, you didn't. You just sat there and watched the story. And like, no, I really felt engaged. Dopamine is that. And the reason why we don't remember data but remember stories is that stories release dopamine, and that gives us ability to remember it better. So wrap your data in story. So when you're an advocate and you want to use stories to get media placement and just to make people be more engaged with what you're writing about, you want to start with your purpose in mind. So you want to find the right stories for World Day of Remembrance and beyond. And that's much easier if you start with your goal in mind. So what do you want people to do because they hear this story? And how can this story illuminate, demystify, and create emotional engagement? Because a lot of times we're talking about policy, we're talking about infrastructure, it can be really dry. You've got to wrap that into a personal story about somebody whose life was very sadly affected by it and why it needs to be changed. So as an advocate, you want to become the source of reliable information to the media. And when that, and Jim's going to go into this and he's an expert at that. But when that happens, know that the media is going to come back to you. And the first time they might just write about one angle of a story, one person. The next time they might come back and go, well, we need 3 examples. So that's why as an executive director, as an advocacy director, as a communications person, you need to start collecting the stories and putting them together. And we focus at Petal Love on teaching you to do 2 to 3 minute short stories, because those are the stories that it's in a media interview. Let me tell you about this. Let me tell you about the other. You're at a city council. You can tell them within the time frame. You can write a blog post. You can write a social media post and more. So short, quick stories that are formatted properly are going to be one of the most powerful tools that you can have in your arsenal for communications, media relations, and beyond. And so you definitely want to start with your purpose in mind. You want to make sure that you always have a call to action with your stories, right? So you've got your purpose, and at the end of it, you want to make sure, you know, there's nothing worse than reading a media story where sometimes they don't include everything, right? They get things wrong, but there's nothing worse than there isn't a website, you don't know how you can volunteer, you don't know how you can go to the event. So whenever you're telling a story, whether it's on your own social media or to the press, you want to make sure, what do you want people to do because of this? Be really clear. Do you want them to show up to a city council meeting? Do you want them to come to a World Day of Remembrance event? Do you want them to give money? Do you want them to become educated in another way? Be really clear about what you want to do, what you want them to do. And you can multi-purpose, I touched on this earlier, but you can multi-purpose these stories. So think about how you can take one story and develop it and use it in many different ways. So this is from Families for Safe Streets 2 years ago. They had a beautiful art event and they did this photo of all of the shoes. This is from Twitter. This is a tweet that they did. And this is from Uganda, I was looking for a Facebook post, and this was the most popular Facebook post. And I had to clip it because the tagline, your attitude is worth more than 1,000 words. And we're really dealing with the fact that we have a toxic car culture and speed culture that is really a fashion. It's an attitude and it can be changed. And so I thought that this was really a great way. Now, what is not being done yet that really can be done and could be done very powerfully is folding the personal stories into these events and putting them in the blogs, the email newsletters, and the social media posts. Now, this has to be somebody who's at a place where they're ready to share the story of themselves with their family members. That's not for everybody. Don't push yourself, but when you're ready, that can be a very powerful way to go. And you can use social media to engage the press, and Twitter is where the journalists are. Twitter is not a mutual follow, so you can follow any journalist that you want to follow. And what I recommend is think about Twitter as your own news feed. Don't get lost down a rabbit hole. Don't spend a lot of time on it. Use it to go look for the journalists that you want to influence and the journalists that you respect, right? So Jeanette Sadakhan, this was a tweet that Leah and I both wanted to make sure that you saw because she's just really good. So today we're talking about bridge building with the media, but every once in a while you want to call them to task. Now she's not talking to one reporter, but she is saying to the New York Times, good grief, right? You wrote a piece about supposedly dangerous bicyclists in Paris, which is not a problem, but here we've got all these road deaths and you're not writing about that. I wanted to point out that this got retweeted 350 times, probably more. I took this tweet about a week ago. So that's really something to think about. So remember, Twitter is where the journalists are. Use it for that. Don't fall down a rabbit hole. Use it as a journalist resource. This is another story that we wanted to call your attention to. This is Erin Sagan on Twitter. She's a Seattle-based freelance journalist that writes for Yes Magazine, The Atlantic, and other great platforms. And she posted this piece a few days ago, hitting all the talking points. It's a beautiful piece. The interesting thing about it is it's on NBC Television's national website under their opinion piece, right? And so you want to follow the journalists that are writing things that you really appreciate. And when they're put in media publications that rarely ever write about it, you want to make sure that you write to those publications and say, thank you very much, please continue this, right? So this week, I'm going to be writing to NBC News and saying, which I never thought I would do, and say, thank you very much. You want to follow the storytelling allies. So we have some fantastic storytelling allies out there. One of them you might not know about is Lloyd Alter out of Canada for Tree Hugger. And he's actually a design and architect writer, but he is a bike rider. He just wrote a book about climate change, and he is obsessed with writing pithy, wonderful pieces about how gigantic cars have gotten and how terrible it is. So this is Lloyd Alter. We are going to share with you at the end of this presentation the different ways that you can follow these people. This is Peter Flax, who's the former editor-in-chief of Bicycling Magazine, now with Red Bull, who became a bike advocate about 7 years ago. And he writes some of the, really, he hits hard about what's going on. And this is, I'll end with Tom Flood. So Tom Flood is actually a creative from the ad agency world who used to work on car campaigns. And then about 6 years ago, he decided, well, my kids are of age, I want to bike to school with them. And then he got out on the streets with his kids and saw it through their lens and said, oh my gosh, this is horrific. So you saw him at the Vision Zero Cities conference, you'll see him at others, we'll probably have a training with him. He is brilliant at just boiling things down, and there's a lot to learn from him. Now, we're going to do one final exercise as I wrap up today and then turn it over to Jim. And this one is that we want you to take 2 minutes and we want you to write down 2 stories that you want to do a better job of getting into the media. It could be a story about your organization and your World Day of Remembrance event or another event, or it could be it's just occurred to you, bing, oh my gosh, I know a personal story that we actually need to be using that we haven't been. So I want you to take the time right now. Again, I'm going to time us for 2 minutes and write down 2 story ideas. Write down 2 story ideas. And what we're going to do is, we're not going to discuss it right now. We're going to go through all of Jim's really meaty ideas. And then at the end, if you have questions about how to make this play out, how to put this into your media strategy, we want to get into that in the question time, okay? So 2 minutes, here we go.
Melissa, can I add one thing?
Yeah.
I think the story and kind of maybe why you want to get it out. It could be in shorthand, but the story and then
absolutely,
or what the ask is. Thank you. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you. So yes, definitely. You always start with your purpose and you always end with your call to action. So make sure, write it down. 2 things, an event or something about your organization, a personal story, And for both of them, what's the ask? Okay, we just have about 30 seconds left. So wrap it up, but remember, keep it close at hand because we are going to have an opportunity to delve deep into this. Okay, and time is up. Thank you, guys. So hold that aside. Don't get rid of it. We're going to ask you to share some thoughts about that. And now I am going to turn it over to Jim. So we'll do the little do-si-do of me going to stop sharing my screen, and we will let Jim start to share his.
You need to make me a co-host.
I sure do. There you go, sir.
All righty, thank you so much. So that we're all on the same page, when I talk about the news media, I'm focusing on news coverage as well as editorial and opinion content, mainly involving newspapers and TV news, because those are the ones that are producing a lot of the daily news that we are keeping an eye on. I'll touch on social media as it relates to newspapers and TV. I'm going to start with a quick history of the news business over the last 40 years. This will help explain a lot about what we see in news coverage today. So prior to the 1980s, news organizations treated news as a public service. There was a clear separation between news coverage and the business side of the operation. And then in the 80s and 90s, there was the era of mergers and takeovers. In 1996, Lowe's Corporation, a hotel and entertainment conglomerate, bought CBS and pushed the CBS News division to become profitable for the first time. To do this, CBS cut its foreign bureaus, its documentary division, and a huge number of newsroom jobs. Similar takeovers happened in a lot of other organizations with similar consequences. This was also the era of cable TV and the 24-hour news cycle, which led to a lot more news sources, as well as the blurring of the line between commentary and what we think of as news. The traditional definition of news was starting to erode. In 1995, Craigslist was founded and took over classified advertising from newspapers, costing them their biggest source of revenue and forcing more cost cutting and layoffs. In the 2000s, news operations shifted to digital platforms to remain profitable, but professional journalists now struggled to compete for attention with bloggers, citizen journalists, YouTubers, and news sources of every kind from all around the world. The Pew Research Center recently reported that there's been a 57% decrease in US newsroom employment since 2008, even as digital platforms have been employing more people. Many reporter positions at the Sacramento Bee, for example, are now held by college interns. So there are fewer and fewer trained, experienced journalists available to cover the safety problems with our streets. But in this environment, the journalists who cover your issues need your expertise more than ever. So your news media strategy should be all about developing relationships with these journalists. As you think about these relationships, there are three things I want you to keep in mind. First, working with the media is a means to an end, and Melissa touched on this earlier. It's a way to elevate and amplify your core advocacy priorities and influence public decision-making. Your news media strategy isn't just about getting coverage, but about making sure that news organizations are covering the right issues in the right way. Second of all, the news media is not a monolith. TV, radio, magazines, and newspapers all operate differently, each with its own style, customs, and focus. For most of you, the news media outlets that matter most are the local ones and the local journalists who cover your issues or should be covering them. Finally, the news media is not the enemy. In fact, the news media exists to represent the interests of the public, which is who you most want to reach. Inadequate or wrong-headed news coverage is, of course, frustrating, it's counterproductive, but it's the result of a lot of complicated factors, including intense competitive pressures and a lack of resources, which I just discussed, as well as journalist inexperience and ignorance of the issues. Remember, we also live in a society where cars and driving are the status quo, and that's reflected in the news coverage we see. I suggest that you think about local news media as one of your core constituencies, just like the way you think about supporters, donors, the business community, elected officials, all groups that you want to inform and influence. So what I encourage you to do is know which outlets and journalists cover your issues. Introduce yourself to them personally, get to know them. Give them your cell number and encourage them to contact you anytime. By the way, I've never had anyone abuse this privilege, so I wouldn't worry about that too much. Follow and interact with them on social media, as Melissa suggested. Also maintain a database of journalists. Include them in your newsletter distribution. Again, this is how you treat them as a constituency. So how do we build these relationships? As I've said, we need journalists to extend, you need journalists to extend your reach to the audience you want to reach, and they need you for your expertise. So it's a two-way street, definitely. I see two basic ways to work with the news media: by helping generate news content and by responding to the content that's being produced. Think of this as kind of an ongoing dialogue. Let's start by looking at how we can generate news content. So in your community, you are a subject expert. Whether you consider yourself that or not, you are a subject expert. Reporters who know about you will ask you to comment or be interviewed on relevant stories, such as a fatal crash or perhaps a proposed infrastructure improvement. I said yes to almost every interview request because it was such an effective way to reach so many people in our region. Be available and be ready to respond to those requests. In most cases, newspaper stories can take several days to put together, but a TV news reporter often will pitch an evening news story to their producer the same afternoon that it's going to air, and then they just have a few hours to produce it. So be prepared to be interviewed within an hour of getting the call, and sometimes sooner. Often I would get a call from a TV reporter and I'd say, well, when do you want to talk to me? And they said, well, we can be to your office in 15 minutes. So I would drop everything and make sure I went to those interviews. When you're contacted for a comment or an interview, ask what the story will cover and then offer your feedback. I would often tell the reporter or a producer what I would be saying about the subject, so there weren't any surprises, and ideally as the way to steer the direction toward my perspective. You should definitely do this while a TV crew is setting up the camera and putting the microphone on you for an interview. Ask the reporter how well they understand the issue and offer to answer questions or give a quick overview. I found that most reporters were not 100% clear on the issue that they were reporting on, and they really appreciated having a moment to talk it over with me. Sometimes they even modified their questions based on what I told them, so do not miss this opportunity. One last thing about TV interviews in particular, TV reporters are looking for brief, concise answers, and they'll re-ask a question if they get an answer that they can't use. You can also ask to answer a question again if you don't land it the first time. So don't worry about this having to be perfect immediately. TV news editors will only use a small amount of the interview footage. I've been interviewed for 15 minutes and 10 seconds of it shows up on the TV news. It's important to be concise, but it's also important to give them plenty to choose from. So go ahead and say what you have to say. And as for for a newspaper interview, if you find that you don't have an answer to a question at your fingertips, it's okay to say so and offer to get back to them as soon as possible. You want to make sure they have all the information they need. 4 or 5 years ago, I was interviewed for a TV news story about the city's first protected bike lanes. In the interview, I discussed why they make bicycling so much safer for everyone. And after we finished and they were putting away the equipment, the reporter, who was a young woman, told me that she had just moved to town and wanted to ride her bike, but said the streets felt too dangerous to her. I told her she was the target demographic of the safety improvement, and I encouraged her to keep following these issues. Remember, journalists are people who live in your community, and they also want safe streets. This is another reason why you want a personal relationship with them. With all of that said, not all interviews go completely smoothly. Some interviewers who aren't well versed in the subject ask the wrong questions or start with the wrong premise. And a few interviewers really prefer to ask pointed questions. And sometimes the context of the interview itself, for example, involving a fatal crash, simply makes the interview difficult. Here are some of the comments or questions you've already heard and that you're likely to encounter in an interview. Pedestrians who wear dark clothes at night are asking to be hit. Jaywalking is a huge problem. Adding a traffic signal will just inconvenience drivers and make traffic worse. Isn't distracted walking just as hazardous as distracted driving? So as you think about responding to these kinds of questions, you want to stay calm and professional. The minute that you become angry or defensive, you're no longer thinking clearly, and that's going to compromise your effectiveness in the interview. You're a lot less likely to be rattled when you've already done your homework, know all your facts, your talking points, all the likely counter arguments you're likely to encounter. Remember, you've heard them all before. You might even consider role-playing this with a colleague so you know what it feels like ahead of time. During the interview, don't hesitate to reframe the question, especially if the questions aren't covering what you want the reporter and the audience to know about the subject. This isn't changing the subject or being uncooperative, but rather taking the opportunity to clarify and provide context. Remember, you are the expert in the interview. Here's a few examples of how you might do that. Sorry, but I just don't see it that way. Here's the real question we really need to be asking. Actually, there's research showing that pedestrian cell phone use is not a major factor in fatal crashes, but we already know that the impairment of distracted driving is comparable to driving drunk. You're asking a complicated question. Let me break it down for you. So think about the language you could develop in responding to some of those tougher questions. One time, a TV reporter who was interviewing me about a fatal bike crash started out by asking whether I knew if the victim had been wearing a bike helmet. And I said, that's the wrong question to ask. It's a lot better to ask what injuries the victim suffered and how fast the car was going, because a bicycle helmet can't protect against a high-speed impact. So you can kind of see where that reporter was starting from. You definitely want to be cooperative in an interview without feeling like you have to say only what the interviewer wants to hear. Say what you need to say, you're the expert. And lastly, when possible, personalize an issue by talking about the experiences of real people. As Melissa explained earlier, that's far more engaging and memorable than a recitation of facts and data. It can turn a story about an abstract, dry, bureaucratic subject into something a lot more relatable. And that can also help the reporter start to see the issue in a new way. So you're also educating the reporter. So if you can acknowledge the actual victim of a crash to illustrate what you're talking about, absolutely do that. In situations where I didn't have someone's story to cite, I talk about my own experience. When possible, I'd have TV reporters interview me next to a busy street, and that would let me describe what I experienced while I was biking there, what conditions made it feel unsafe for me, and how much harder it can be for people who don't ride as confidently as I do. And then I'd ask the reporter how they feel riding there. As I said, an interview is a dialogue. You may recognize this activist. Yes, that is Leah at a rally from several years back when she was the executive director of the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. You can help generate news content by creating opportunities for journalists to cover your issues. There are several ways to do this. As Melissa talked about, you can host a press event where you announce a major advocacy initiative or a call to action about an intersection where fatal crashes keep occurring. But if you don't have the bandwidth or resources to do that, you can invite a reporter to meet you for a walk or a bike ride to explain the issue or show them the problem. TV reporters in particular are looking for visual stories where they can participate, so keep that in mind. Don't hesitate to contact reporters directly with story ideas. This could be about an issue that hasn't hit the news yet, or perhaps about an activist you know who is rallying their neighbors to address a dangerous intersection. In other words, something that might not ever get covered except that you told the reporter about it. And this goes back to what Melissa was explaining to you in that exercise she had you do. Pitch your idea to your one best news contact. Local journalists are all competing for stories. When you pitch your story to everyone at the same time, it only frustrates them and alienates them. You absolutely want to give your great story idea to the one person who is likeliest to run with this. And now I want to take a moment to say a few words about press releases. A press release is typically used to make a major announcement or talk about an event like the World Day of Remembrance. It contains the basic facts, the who, what, why, when, and how. You email it unsolicited to multiple news outlets at the same time. And this is the important part. You have to follow up with each one to make sure they received it and are interested in learning more. Keep in mind that lots of other organizations, businesses, and causes are also sending reporters press releases. So while it can be a good organizing tool, there's no guarantee that you're going to absolutely get coverage from it. It's a good starting point. For anything other than a major announcement or a mass event, I don't actually think a press release is necessary. I propose a story to a reporter by emailing the basic idea of the story and asking them to call me for more information. This usually got the same results as writing and broadcasting a press release, but with a lot less work on my part. So think about how to use your time wisely. Another way to generate news content is to use your platform, such as social media or a blog or your newsletter, to talk about an issue that isn't being covered or to amplify on an incomplete news story. In the Sacramento area, every fatal traffic crash involving a bicyclist or pedestrian is covered as news. But often these stories are based on the brief press announcement issued by at the scene by law enforcement. And since reporters are usually rushing to get the story out, they often go with whatever minimal information they have. And since these are the stories are the main way that the community hears about a fatal bike crash, as executive director at SABA, I want to give a more complete perspective. I'd link the story in a Facebook post and write a detailed explanation about where the traffic occurred, the number of traffic lanes, traffic volumes, the speed limit, the distance between controlled intersections, the presence or absence of bike lanes, all the potential contributing factors that the news coverage will never mention. This way, our Facebook followers weren't only relying on incomplete coverage, and because not relying on incomplete coverage, and because reporters were following us on Facebook, often I would get calls from reporters who saw one of those posts. When there wasn't local news coverage, news stories to discuss, I'd also use social media to comment on news stories in other communities that mirrored or illustrated issues in Sacramento. I mainly did this to generate social media content, but one time it really showed me just how much local journalists were paying attention to what we were saying. In September 2018, the Wall Street Journal published an article called "The Most Dangerous Place to Bicycle in America," and it was about the Tampa Bay area in Florida. The article listed the top 10 most dangerous places, and it turns out the Sacramento was number 5. So I posted a link to the story on Facebook and highlighted Sacramento's rank, since I figured the news media wouldn't have read the article or realized there was a Sacramento angle. But by doing that, I just handed them a story they never would have done. And sure enough, I immediately got 3 requests for TV interviews and a request for a radio interview. It was my busiest news day ever. So look at that as a strategy for getting some attention. Responding to a local news story as a reader is a way to directly engage with the journalists that are covering your issues. And when you're doing so, follow the human resources advice to praise in public and criticize in private. And I'm talking about the stories where they really got something right or they really got something wrong. When you see a particularly positive story, immediately contact the reporter by phone or by email to give them a thank you and a thumbs up. And you might want to CC the editor or the news director too. And it's okay to be brief. Praise the story on social media and tag the author. This is praise in public. Share good stories with your constituency through your email newsletter and be sure the reporter is on your distribution. What you're doing is shining a light on the good work. But at the same time, when there's a problematic story, you want to also contact the reporter. You want to make sure your tone is respectful and professional. It's okay to express strong concern about a story, but don't burn bridges by blasting or shaming. There's no reason to make this personal. Instead, focus on the story and be specific about what is negative, missing, inaccurate, or misleading, and give examples of better alternatives. This is your teachable moment. This is where you get to show your expertise. And ask the reporter for a follow-up conversation to understand where they're coming from. Again, you want to have a dialogue with them. While I would normally resist going to social media about a problematic story to avoid burning a bridge, you may want to do this if the story is really serious. If you decide to go this route, just do it thoughtfully and never as an alternative to communicating directly with the reporter. Again, blasting, accusing, or shaming someone publicly will burn a bridge you're trying to build and you want to maintain. Another way you can respond to a story is to ask about contributing a commentary or a rebuttal. Many newspapers accept guest commentaries, and as Melissa pointed out, some radio and TV stations also run commentaries, either recorded or published on their website. So you want to find out which news outlets in your community do this and inquiring about the guidelines for contributing. Back in July of 2015, the Sacramento Bee editorial page ran a scathing guest commentary called "Sacramento is not a friendly city for bicyclists, not a friendly city for cyclists." I knew I would have to respond to this publicly in some way, so I immediately contacted the editorial page editor, who just so happened to also be a regular bike rider, to ask about writing a rebuttal. He was happy to let me do it. The following week, they published my response, in which was my chance to talk about the city's very outdated bicycle master plan and how little they were planning to spend to update it. The commentary and my reply both got a very big response. But my response to the Bee was part of a bigger effort that also helped persuade the city to commit more funds to hiring a consultant to help with the update. The city also reassigned the bicycle pedestrian coordinator in charge of the update to a different department, which frankly was an absolutely amazing win. Again, working with the news media should always be a means to an end. I want to close by spending a few minutes talking about the research by Tara Goddard at Texas A&M University and Kelsey Ralph at Rutgers about the consequences of inaccurate, misleading, or incomplete news stories about traffic crashes. It bears directly on how you interact with the news media and how you respond to news stories about crashes. Some of you are already familiar with these findings. Goddard and Ralph had subjects read one of 3 versions of a news story about a hypothetical fatal crash involving a pedestrian. After reading the story, subjects were asked to apportion blame, identify the appropriate punishment for the driver, and also to talk about various approaches for improving roadway safety. And when they compared the responses from the 3 groups, it turned out that relatively subtle differences in editorial patterns significantly affected the way that readers interpreted what happened and what to do about it. So while news organizations aren't responsible for making our roads safe, they influence the perceptions of a huge number of people in your community, far more people than you're going to be able to reach directly. If they're leaving readers and viewers uncertain about the value of safety improvements, they're making your work that much harder. These research findings are also another reason to talk to your local reporters and editors. So as soon as I learned about this research, I started writing letters. I started using it to comment on news stories I saw about crashes. So in December of 2019, a Sacramento TV news station reported about a pre-dawn crash in which a driver killed a pedestrian. The news team mentioned in this order the deadly crash, the snarled morning commute traffic, the damaged SUV, before stating that a pedestrian had been killed, and they never mentioned the driver at all. They never even said the word driver. So I contacted the news director for the station to express my concern and to explain the research findings. He sent back a lengthy reply acknowledging my email. This was essentially a letter to the editor, a really old-fashioned way to respond to news stories, but it's also easy and effective, especially since editors and reporters keep close track of the responses to their stories as one way to help decide what to cover and how to cover it. When you're using the research findings to respond to a story, email the reporter as soon as possible. And for a TV news story, consider contacting the news director. They're the ones who assign crash stories to one of perhaps several reporters. Share the link to the research findings and attach the summary of the research findings that we're going to be sending to you. We have a 3-page handout that's super helpful. Keep your tone and respectful and professional. Focus on the story, not on the reporter. As I've said before, avoid blasting, accusing, or shaming. Be specific about the problematic aspects, and as well as better alternatives. Tell them how they could have done a better job, and offer to answer any questions or follow up by phone. This is a case where you actually do want to post on social media. Many of your supporters will already recognize the problems with these stories. I used to get calls all the time by people who would say, "Did you see that story? They talked about the bicyclist as if he caused the crash." So this is your way to explain why these stories are problematic. Also consider encouraging your supporters to send their own responses to these kinds of stories. While journalists and editors are unlikely to change the way they cover traffic crashes based on one message from you, a groundswell of response from many others will definitely get their attention. Plus, you're educating the person you're contacting. So again, this is a teachable moment. And be sure you don't overlook the stories that are written the right way. In May of 2020, I emailed a San Jose Mercury news reporter who wrote a news story about a pedestrian fatality that almost perfectly embodied the researchers' recommended best practices. He got it right by discussing the driver's role and by providing key details about the location. Even the headline nailed it. I emailed him to express my thanks, and I attached the research summary. He replied with a brief note of thanks, and he said, "I printed this out." That's the kind of impact you want. You want to put this in the hands of everybody who's writing these stories. So in closing, I encourage you to recognize that working with the media is something you can prepare for. If you're new to it, it can take time, and you'll get better at it. Don't worry about that. I hope some of these ideas will help you add to your news media toolkit and improve your skills. And I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa. You need to unmute, Melissa.
Unmute.
Oops, there you go. Great details. Yes, we've already had people ask because they don't want to miss anything you said. So we are going to be sharing Jim's notes probably within tomorrow. That will be available for the Vision Zero Network team to have. And now what we're going to do is a little bit of role playing. We want you to see how it plays out, because it's nerve-wracking to start stepping forward and talking to the press. This is something that myself and Jim and Leah and a few others of you have been doing for a while now. A couple of you are community reporters, and so you've been on the other, wearing a different hat at a different time, having some great comments here. So what we're going to do is we're going to share in the text box a series of questions. And they're going to be questions from a reporter, pretend questions that we've put together, and they're going to have an answer. Now, the first time we do this, Jim is going to play the reporter and Leah is going to play the who she is. and so let's see. Kate, do you have that lined up to copy and paste it in? You do. Fantastic. So what I want you to do is, she's not going to say this word for word. She's going to put it into her own words, but I want you to see her process of how she put this together. And this is going to start putting your hands in the clay to get ready for your own World Day of Remembrance. Then after she does this, I'm going to play the reporter, and we're going to ask if one of you wants to just read the script we have that we've prepared, or you can wing it yourself. So I'm going to mute myself and I'm going to line it up. Leah, can you see in the chat box? And Jim, can you see in the chat box the reporter question and the answer? Are we clear on that?
Yep. All right, here we go with our interview. Leah, given the increase in traffic deaths, especially among pedestrians, don't we need better education of pedestrians who are behaving unsafely, maybe more enforcement against distracted walking? Why is there so much emphasis on drivers? Why aren't we all equally responsible?
I think we all understand that we want to make sure people know the rules of the road, yet the most important changes we can make to ensure safety are really on the street design and on the way that our speeds are set. We know that, each one of us, whether it was me walking here today, or maybe you driving here today, or that person biking down the street right now, each one of us is really, in an environment that they don't necessarily control. So what we're doing with our Vision Zero work is looking to our elected officials and the planners and engineers who have so much influence to really make sure that they design these roads to be safe for me and my family and your neighbors. No one wants an injury or fatality. And we know that we can change the systems we're in.
Thank you.
And okay, maybe can I'll be honest, it's fine. I did have that answer already written, and yet still I stumbled. I just want to be honest about that. So maybe I'll reflect a second on what I would have done differently if I were answering perfectly. And I'll say, if it's okay with you, I would love to say, I think the hard part of that question, and Jim, you asked it in a very nice way. I mean, your tone of voice was very nice. I just want to be honest. Sometimes the tone of voice might be something like, come on, people are walking out in the middle of the street. They're wearing dark clothes. The question might feel a little bit antagonistic.
Yeah.
And that's part of the reporter's job. I mean, I don't love it, but right, reporters are right about conflict. So I just want to maybe could I share if you were to ask me that last part again, Jim, like the last sentence or two, I'm going to give an example of what my gut wants to do, but I don't do. So I'm going to do a no, but which I definitely have done by accident before. So maybe.
All right, I'll ask it again. So why is there so much emphasis on drivers? Why isn't everyone equally responsible?
Look, it's cars that are hitting and killing people. I mean, you can't look at me for that. I mean, I'm just walking. I mean, that's crazy for you to talk about my responsibility when I'm just walking or biking. I do feel that way. I very much personally feel that way. And I think that's the right thing, but that is certainly not what I want to say to a reporter. And I'll say, if I was really stumped by that question, obviously I wasn't because I had it beforehand, but if I was really stumped, one thing I might say is buy myself some time. I've done this a million times. So if Jim asked that question, I might pause and go, it's a really good question. Give me a second. And it's okay. They will wait. They will wait, and you can make them wait. That is fine. Formulating. I literally will turn and I'll say, hold on one second, and I'll write a sentence down. That's okay. I mean, it's, especially if you're on the phone, just say, hold on one second. Well, I've got another call. No, you can pretend, but you write something down and be prepared. Or if you're really stumped by it, say, you know what? I want to give this some thought. Can I call you back in 5 minutes? That's okay to do that.
Leah, can I add to that? That's a really good technique with newspaper reporters because often their deadlines are a little bit longer. They have a little more time. It's going to be harder to do when you're looking into a camera. But again, this is this is an endorsement of rehearsing some of these basic questions ahead of time. If you have somebody you can role play with, just like we're doing here, you get a sense of what it's like to be asked a question in an antagonistic way that doesn't throw you off your center.
Right.
So Melissa, I think you're going to do the second question. Is that right?
And I'd like to ask, I know there's some questions or responses.
Yeah, there's some questions. And so I think, Leah, we want to dig a little bit into that more. Okay. So Leah, you have a question lined up already.
And I'd love to hear yours. For instance, Sarah, I appreciate Sarah, you typed a question in. Do you mind, do you want to ask that now? Or do you want me to read that? I'd love to open that up for people.
Oh, no, it didn't really make sense to me why. I mean, that sounded like a really honest and true and just a really great response. I'm not understanding why that's a no-no.
I appreciate that. Thank you for asking it. You are right that it is honest and true. And it's honestly, though, not the message I want to get across. It's a really good example of if my goal in this situation, let's pretend a scenario we're trying to fix a street or trying to get a law passed or something locally. If my goal were to frankly change hearts and minds and to get in, frankly, the politicians' heads that this is a very reasonable thing to do, that it's not, it is controversial probably, but that it's not, you know, crazy. And I'm being honest with you guys, this is a room full of people who understand this issue. You know, we are pushing for something that many mainstream people and media and electeds do not understand. I don't want to say they don't care, but they don't understand it. So I think part of what we've got to do with the media is not miscommunicate or not say things that are not true, but to say it in ways that are going to be heard by people who are not, frankly, in the trenches advocating every day and deep in this issue. So, you know, there's a way to kind of take a question that might have felt a little antagonistic and like pedestrians are always at fault. I'm not going to, you know, start hollering with this reporter and be like, you're crazy. That's so untrue. I mean, I could, and I want to deep down, but to be honest, if I'm going to try and move the conversation, be more effective, I'm going to say, you know, actually, it's interesting you say that. I might, you know, try and calm myself down a little bit. Interesting. And then formulate my thoughts. In fact, the data shows that, you know, obviously, you know, that automobiles are much more dangerous. We know that. And just to really say it in a way that is more measured. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So one of the things I want to pipe in about here that I want all of us to take a deep breath about when we're dealing with the media is that remembering that everybody sees the world through their own lens. And before you got involved in this work, before you or somebody you loved got really hurt, was convenience and speed something you thought about a lot? Because that's the way our culture is. And so remember, that's probably the way the reporter's seen it or his news director. I'm not saying it's the right way, but what Leah's pointing at, and it's hard to do when you've personally or somebody in your family and it's triggering, you've got to recognize, okay, do I want to be right? Or do I want to be effective? You're already right. So now what we're talking about is trying to get you to see the world a little bit differently, step back and go, okay, what I want to do in this point is I want to be effective. I want to say things that the reporter might not actually quite agree with me, but he's going to leave, he or she's going to leave going, oh, street design set it up for this all to be about. Oh yeah, that's right. When I was a kid, cars weren't this big. Yeah, we didn't have dashboards with everybody distracted. Yeah, we didn't have cell phones. I mean, you get them thinking about it and it's hard. Like Leah said, you get really emotional about it. So you've got it, like Jim said, we've got to start to practice with each other and recognize what's going to happen. So do we want another question, Leah, right now? Is there one that you and Allie had lined up? Do you want to talk about it, or do we want to take another one and see what it looks like?
Another minute. Does anyone else have thoughts on that or related to the really good point, Sarah, that you just brought up? And let me say, I want to add in, for me, answering that question as an advocate without personal experience, I just want to say is different than for those of you that do have personal experience. And I would probably think and suggest, yes, you would have a different and probably more emotional answer, and that would be understood or, you know, valued more than maybe me.
I wonder too, just point of clarification, it sounds like you're also trying to keep your eyes on the prize, so to speak, that
Yes.
you really want to keep the focus on what I heard was street design is an issue, and you want to yeah, I guess that's all. You just want to keep the focus on that, despite the reality.
Could I respond also to that? Sarah, I really appreciate you drawing that distinction. I kind of thought of myself as representing the issue and representing the organization and not speaking as Jim, the personal individual. My own opinions on this issue, my emotions about the issue aren't necessarily relevant to the bigger goal of getting that reporter to talk about why the streets are in bad shape. Right. So if the whole point of the, if the whole point of the interview is to leave them with this idea that everybody benefits when the streets are safer for people on bikes or people on foot, that's more important ultimately than me demonstrating to the reporter that I am angry or that I am grief-stricken or whatever emotion I'm feeling. The other thing to remember here too, and I meant to say this earlier, each community and each organization has a different culture. And some communities, so in San Francisco, for example, the media is more aggressive and more confrontational. And in Sacramento, it's definitely not. So I remember when I moved from Cowbike to Sacramento Area Bicycle Advocates, one of the very first things I said on social media was a little more pointed because I was used to communicating with Bay Area reporters and with Los Angeles reporters. And I got a nasty little comment back from somebody saying, you can't bring that big city attitude to Sacramento because that's not how we do it. And I had to sort of reel it back and realize, oh yeah, there's a different style in different communities. So it is valuable to express emotion and to be heartfelt in what you're saying. How much of that you express partly depends on how your organization functions and sort of what the culture is in your community.
Other thoughts or feedback on this? And no pressure, we're going to move to a second example.
No, I did want to bring up one point, and to kind of, because Sarah's opened up a lot of good things here. We're talking about street design, but for example, and Tara and Kelsey's research shows, the way the media in general talks about who caused the crash, it's as if cars are beings, right? And the car jumped the curb, the car ran over, all these things. So yeah, definitely, it's not always about design. It is about, well, no, it was a driver driving. So you can certainly be clear with people. What we really want to make sure is, especially if this is something that's happened to you personally, make sure that you're not going to step forward and tell the story in a way that's going to be harmful and triggering to you. Like, just recognize that even talking about this sometimes is really hard, and just know that about yourself and kind of do your best to prepare and get ready for that, because the reporter's not standing in your shoes, unfortunately, right? And so you want to be prepared. That it's a horrible fact that people just go on to the next thing, and you're like, this is terrible, somebody died here. So make sure that you prep yourself about that. But definitely when they're talking about things like the car did it, no, it was somebody driving. So what do we want to go, what question do we have next?
Yeah, I think the second question, and I want to say thank you, Allie from Walk SF volunteered. She was voluntold, I think. So Melissa, do you want to do that one?
Yes, let me scroll it up so I can see here. Like, it's, for some reason, it's giving me a hard time. Let's see here. And
I've got it here. Do you want me to run with it, Melissa?
Yeah, for some reason, I'm not getting the actual question, just the advocate answer. Can you play
Yes.
reporter?
Great. So Allie, you're with the organization Walk SF, and I know you guys are working on Vision Zero. You say your goal is zero traffic deaths, but how is that even possible? I mean, are we ever going to reach that? I mean, everyone makes mistakes. Isn't that far-fetched?
Exactly. Everyone makes mistakes. Yes, is my first answer. That's precisely why Vision Zero is Vision Zero, because we are all fallible. The system must not be fallible. The system mustn't be fallible. So we have in our hands proven tools to redesign our transportation system in a way that anticipates mistakes and helps make sure those mistakes are not deadly. So we have the capacity right now to redesign our roads to be safer, to slow speeds of vehicles with smart technology, and to prioritize safety over speed in our systems and policies. These are far from impossible things. We have the tools, we have the data. In fact, other countries have reached zero. What we need is the will.
I think that's awesome. Yeah, Allie, I mean, to take what was kind of an aggressive question, and we all get this. How many people have gotten that question? That's impossible, or, you're reaching for the stars, or usually more negative than that. And for you to be able to not kind of get pulled into their negativity and to turn it and be like, you're right. Look at you, make them feel good, and then actually respond with information that's very different than what they were thinking, but the crux of what we want to say. So I think that's great.
So I think that it would be great, because we have about 13 minutes left. Remember that we asked you guys to lay down a stretch and a visionary goal. And then we asked you about 2 stories that you want to do a better job of telling for World Day of Remembrance and beyond. And so I would like to ask, and Leah or I or Jim can take the questions, who's willing to step forward and share lay down a stretch or a visionary goal, or 2 stories that you want to do a better job telling? Anybody raise your hand if you want to share with us something? We will call on you if we. Susie, go ahead.
I apologize in advance. This is actually a question. So one thing I really struggle with is that I don't have a personal story of somebody I know being seriously injured or killed so far. Thank goodness so far. But I very closely track all the fatalities and serious injuries in my town. And I've always felt really uncomfortable just out and sharing other people's stories, knowing that they may have family or friends that may see it and they could be upset. So, I mean, do y'all have any recommendations for approaching that? Like telling someone's story when you haven't actually talked to the person or talked to their family?
Really good question.
I have one thought. I absolutely, Susie, I think that is definitely my feeling as well. As somebody who kind of speaking more broadly on traffic safety issues, I'm not going to share names or situations without talking with people first. But what I do, and it depends on the question and such, but what I do is kind of bring it back. Maybe it's not an individual personal story. That's one thing, but it's putting faces on data. I think that's something you guys mentioned earlier, Melissa and Jim. For instance, I can spout all day 42,060 traffic deaths a year in 2020 or last year in 2020. And some people's eyes just glaze over. It's important. That number is important. It's horrific. But then I'll say, and it's true, but I'll switch it to, and these are disproportionately children and seniors. In fact, traffic deaths are the leading cause of death of traffic crashes, the leading cause of death of youth. Think about the children in your life. Every one of us has, whether it's kids, nieces, nephews, you can kind of weave it back if it's not an individual story, but to say, in my city, 42 people died last year. Some of them were children, some of them were senior citizens. And let me say, though my parents might disagree that I was a drama queen as a kid, I want to be careful that there's a difference. I think there's an important line to weigh here where you don't want to be dramatic to be dramatic's sake. But I've learned as an advocate, and I think the question you're asking, Susie, is really important, that there's an important line there, but you can use the true emotion and hard things to help move the cause forward. Do you know what I mean? So I would just say, and I'd love other people's experiences or reactions to this. You don't want to be looking like you're taking advantage, but there is a reality there. And I think, so many of you all know this, our cause for safety is honestly being advanced by the willingness of people to share their stories, or even for us to be more explicit with, these are people, stop telling me numbers. These are people. So a long answer, my reaction.
Susie, one thing I did the same thing that you did in Sacramento. I documented every one of the fatalities. I even created a map, so I knew exactly, I just took a Google map and I dropped pins. I could tell you exactly how many fatalities occurred south of Highway 50 in Sacramento, which was predominantly a lower income, mixed race part of the city. So one thing you could do is to kind of cite those statistics, which is that most of these crashes are happening in underserved communities. That's another way, like Leah was saying, you can sort of characterize the kinds of crashes that are happening. The other thing to remember here is, while you don't need to tell someone else's story in any detail, those fatal crashes were almost always reported as a news story. So it's pretty easy to remind the reporter, remember back in December, there was a fatal crash at an intersection just like this. This is the same kind of problem, right? So without even naming names or getting into any demographic specifics, you can remind them that they covered a similar story 6 months ago involving the same circumstances. So those are some ways that you're kind of pointing to the stories, but you're not necessarily telling the stories. The last thing I'll add is that when I was at Calbike, we were working on the first attempt to get a 3-foot passing law passed in California. It took 3 tries. The first time, my job was to gather the stories about the victims. And I had all of those stories. They were usually news stories. Sometimes I would get somebody who would call me to tell me about a crash they had been in, or a family member had been in. And I wrote them all up as little narratives because I wanted to have them ready, because I would send them to the legislator in whose district that occurred. So when it came time to ask for that person's vote, I'd say, I want to remind you that this person died in a strike from behind collision 5 years ago. And so you can gather stories that way. It doesn't put you in the position of you verbally telling somebody else's story, but you can write what amounts to a little news story about that crash. Mine were very basic. They didn't try to convey any emotion. Usually the situation themselves were so disturbing that you didn't need to add any emotion. You just needed to read what happened. That can also have the same effect on the recipient as them hearing you tell a story, but without having you kind of violate somebody else's privacy. Of course, these were all stories that I collected. These were all stories that we used with the consent of survivors and families. They were all very supportive of what we were trying to do. And then one last thing that I would do that I encourage all of you to try is talk about your own experience. I've ridden almost every street, it seems, in Sacramento, or almost all of them. And I would stand at the curb with a TV reporter and say, look at that, where does the bicycle ride, right? And so what I was doing is I was making myself the surrogate, not necessarily the victim, but the person that they could focus on, right? So I personalized the issue, not by talking about the person who died on that street, but by saying, look at the potholes, look at the narrow space I'm riding in, look at the broken pavement, look at the speed of the traffic. How would you feel riding here? I think to amplify a point that Leah said, be sincere in your response, right? It's okay to say, this is horrifying. You don't have to do it in tears. You don't have to do it at the top of your voice. You're not trying to argue with the news reporter. They're not the problem. But you can speak sincerely and emphatically to them in a way that that expresses the emotion, but without taking it over the edge and leaving the reporter in a situation where they're maybe unexpectedly dealing with a person who is kind of coming undone about something. So
guys, we only have like 5 minutes left. Thank you, Jim. That was
sure.
Great. And we want to leave you guys feeling that you have greater clarity, that what we shared with you today illuminates maybe some things that you weren't quite understanding about the media. Leah and Kate are going to follow up with you with all the documents. We did share the tip sheet, which had Kelsey and Tara's research in it, the 3-page tip sheet, which Jim put together. It's a fantastic resource. So it's here, you can download it. They're going to all be mailed to you. My 10-page story map is going to be mailed to you. And I just want to close on, do you feel greater clarity? Can we see a show of hands that do people feel greater clarity on what they want to go out and do with your own media program? Fantastic. Now, are you clear on what a lay down, stretch, and visionary goal could be for yourself? Are you feeling something? Is an idea coming together for you that you're like, yeah, I'm ready to start sharing more stories? Anybody ready for that? Anybody ready to? And Leah, you've got something you want to share. Yeah.
Can I ask if people are comfortable, if people would chat, put in the chat one of their goals, maybe write it stretch blank, or what was the other one?
A lay down goal.
Lay down blank, stretch down. We won't hold you to
Visionary
it,
goal.
or maybe we will. Maybe we'll follow up with you. But yeah, everybody maybe type one in if you're willing. You don't have to do all three, but type one thing in that because it's helpful for us too to see, what ideas.
Yeah, perfect. And on that, I know that World Day of Remembrance is less than a month away, about a month away. But if you have areas where you're like, I'm still feeling kind of stuck, or this is where I'd like to go in the future, that really helps Leah and Jim and Kate and I figure out what kind of training you want next. Okay, so share something that you're ready to try, but also share, oh man, I'm still kind of struggling, and this is what I would like some help with next.
Awesome. Yeah, keep writing those in, and we'll wind down if that's okay. Yeah. Great. These are really helpful. Thank you, guys. And you might, honestly, by sharing your idea, maybe it's not even a goal yet. Maybe it's just an idea. You might spur someone else to be like, oh, I never thought of that. I could do that.
I'm seeing some, like, my chat is like minimized for some reason, so I'm only getting to look about this much, but what I'm seeing is really awesome. And we're going to save all this because it's so good. Thank you, guys. Have Vision Zero on Jane Pauley, CBS Sunday Morning. Laura Friedrichs, yes, I'm
Work
with
your
you.
magic.
Absolutely, absolutely. I love the way you're thinking.
Absolutely, this is great.
Create a crash map of Minnesota. Fantastic. I love that.
Check with your highway patrol. They may already have one. I can tell you how to find them.
Great.
Great
Thank you.
How to
goal.
get Philly Eagles involved with our World Day of Remembrance this year. Go for it. Absolutely.
Right. Awesome. Keep writing them in. Thank you all so much for taking time. Melissa and Jim, woohoo, big props.
Thank you.
Feeling encouraged to be more disciplined to build relationships with journalists. We frequently miss their deadlines. Ooh, okay, you can't miss their deadlines. Their deadlines are solid. I am so glad to see this one. Bravo, good for you.
Awesome. So when we share this out, you guys, as we've said, Jim and Melissa have some great tips that we went through quickly, but they'll share more detail. We're going to share some ideas that are particularly around World Day of Remembrance. I encourage you to read this through, but also share it with others. I know not everybody could be on this call. That's okay. Share it with colleagues or friends who you think could be helpful or who want to help. And I want to emphasize, we spend a lot of time on interviews, I think partly because that is one of the most intimidating parts, let's be honest. But for those that aren't comfortable with that, or maybe think, okay, someone else is doing the interviewing, I don't want to do that. You still have a really important role to play, whether that's, great examples people talked about, like sending an email to a reporter with information, or commending them when something good happens, or politely correcting them when something good is not written. But again, to really say we're in a symbiotic relationship with the media. I think you said that, Jim. I really appreciate that. Frankly, we are trying to use the media as a means to an end to make change. And the media needs us and what we're doing because it is news. It is newsworthy. So, really think about your power there and flexing that. And I'll just share one last one. I love the idea of teachable moments. You guys said that a lot. Some teachable moments might be really subtle. And I just want to share one that I just thought of as we were talking, that NBC News article that somebody shared in the beginning. Melissa, you mentioned it, and then Kate put it in the chat if you go back to the very beginning, but we'll include it. I think that came out like within the last week. Really good story, terrible title, but really good story. You could literally take that story, which is all, it's about the rise in traffic deaths and what people can do about it. You could take that national story, take the link, send it to 1 or 10 reporters who you have a relationship or you think do good work. Literally send it to a reporter and say, hi, Bill, I noticed you wrote about traffic safety a year and a half ago, or I met you once, or I really appreciated your blah, blah, blah. I want to share this story with you that shows the scope of the national problem of traffic safety in this country. Did you know that our city of Waterloo, Iowa, also saw a significant increase in traffic deaths? Let me tell you about it, blank, blank, blank.
Yep.
Suddenly you might have a local story there. And by the way, come to World Day of Remembrance, or here's what we're doing for World Day of Remembrance. And here's 3 people I hope you'll talk to. All right, I'm just throwing that out.
And there's one more story that that goes along those lines. So I'll share that with you that I just saw today. And what got removed, let's end on this. People would just say, this is just the way things are. This is just the way we need to be speedy. And then the streets were empty and COVID and people went crazy, right? With this terrible driving behavior because all of a sudden they were on a speedway and they thought it was okay. That's not the way most people drive, but COVID really showed us, no, we really have got to get a handle on this. So you've got something, and you know, the statistics just keep getting worse. So thank you all for this. We hope that you will follow us on Twitter. We hope that you will stay engaged. We hope you'll let us know what kind of training you need next. Share with your goals. And you know what? When you hit one of your goals, tag us on Twitter and let us know because we would like to amplify it. Absolutely. And I'm sure Leah does as well, right? So thank you all. Have a beautiful rest of your night. We so appreciate the work you do. Final thoughts, Jim?
I'm really glad that we had a chance to talk about this as much as we did. Your questions and observations are spot on. I appreciate everything that you've had to say today. And you're all doing really excellent work. Know that you are appreciated. Know that you're making a big difference. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you,
Leah, we're going to end it with you.
Appreciate people staying up late.
Yes, thank you guys so much. We really appreciate it.
Good night. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Melissa Balmer with pedallove.org. On October 27th, 2021, my colleague Jim Brown and I taught this live recorded class hosted by the Vision Zero Network. At Pedal Love, we share storytelling, media relations, and leadership tools and classes to help you in your work to create safer streets and a more sustainable world. Find out about our upcoming classes, our backgrounds in active mobility advocacy, request a workshop for your own organization, and all of the free tools we have available, all at pedallove.org.